Welcome back. I am John P. Today we are going to be having a little bit of a discussion on in-house movements. I am asked about in-house movements all the time, and I can understand why. Within the last 5 years and moving on to 10 years really, in-house movements have been kind of a hot topic. Watch collectors will go onto forums and YouTube like we are here now, and so many other places, and they want to talk about brands that feature in-house movements. Now, before we jump into that conversation, whether or not I think in-house movements really matter, and also dispelling what I feel is a myth, I do want to ask that if you haven't already, please check out delraywatch.com, where we have so many cool watches for you to add to your collection, or we also buy watches if you are looking to thin the herd, as they say. And also on the wrist today, I have my Rolex Oyster Perpetual 39 Red Grape. I love this watch. It's kind of my everyday wear. Very cool watch, and I'd recommend picking up one of these if you are in the market sooner than later, because they've developed a cult following, and now they're very difficult to get, at least at what I consider to be a reasonable ticket. Also, please do not forget to check out sinclairstraps.com for the best premium watch straps. So back to the topic for today, in-house movements, do they matter? Now, what is an in-house watch movement? Now, for decades and decades, watch movements were shared between manufacturers, right? They would have third-party manufacturers that would make the mechanisms that go into the watches that make them tick, make them run, and actually produce the timekeeping abilities of the watches. There is ETA, there is Ronda if we start talking about quartz, and there are so many others now that exist, such as Sellita, and there have been others in the past that have gone defunct or were rolled up into other companies, think A-Shield, and so many others. There were so many different manufacturers of movements. Now, over time, things consolidated, and brands, or companies rather, such as ETA, now owned by Swatch Group, have really sucked up those manufacturers and used them to produce more of the same movements and movement families that they were already producing. Or perhaps they, under certain circumstances, they adopted that particular movement and made it part of their actual manufacturer or their brand. So that is what has been happening. But within the last 5 to 10 years, there's been kind of this interesting trend, I would say, of if a watch doesn't feature an in-house movement, it's just not good. This is something I hear all the time is, oh, does that watch have an in-house movement? Or I'm not into it, it only has an ETA movement or a Sellita movement, so I'd rather have an in-house movement. But this is something that I think is oftentimes hurting the collector, because you're overlooking watches that would keep amazing timekeeping just for the fact of you read somewhere or you heard that in-house movements are better. But when we talk about in-house movements, it's important to note that many brands today are pairing up or purchasing pieces of watch movement manufacturers or creating their own and sharing the movements with other brands, much like you would see if you were a manufacturer buying watch movements from a company like ETA. There have been times where Swatch, who own ETA, has pulled back supply and has attempted, or there was speculation that other brands would get hurt. And so then, of course, they've made these partnerships. Think the B01 chronograph movement being used by Tudor, and vice versa. Actually, Tudor has supplied three-hander movements to Breitling, for that matter, with the B20 movement. And there's been other cross-sharings and partnerships, think Vaucher with different ownership in the Sandoz Foundation and Parmigiani and Hermes, and these brands kind of cross-sharing with the movements. Now, that is something that's happening, and if we use this catch-all term of in-house, I think we can oftentimes overlook really great watches that maybe otherwise we would have purchased, loved, and enjoyed if we weren't just sticking and clinging onto this in-house term. Now, I think there is a very important distinction when talking about in-house movements, that there are high-end independent manufacturers, think FP Journe, think Kari Voutilainen, think these high-end independent manufacturers that do produce their own movements. Think H. Moser, even one that I talk about all the time, other people talk about. It's really at the forefront of being top to bottom vertically integration for their manufacturer, all the way from the hairsprings to the movements of the case. H. Moser does it all. There are these distinctions between in-house, truly in-house, and the in-house of, hey, we're sharing a manufacturer with these other brands and calling it the in-house. Or oftentimes a brand will have their caliber and they'll kind of allude to the fact that this is our, our special caliber movement, but actually it might just be a heavily modified ETA or something along those lines. So I think it's important that as watch collectors, and this is sometimes that I would give this advice if someone asked me, and this is personally how I also look at it with my watches, is wouldn't you rather the watch be stable, right? Think about when Tudor came out with their GMT watch. It had the issue with the date for their in-house movement. Now, of course, it's been rectified, but it didn't have the benefit of having decades and decades of iterative changes to the movements to make it rock solid and a workhorse movement, as we like to say in watch collecting, right? Think of something like Rolex. Yes, it's an in-house movement, but they have changed that movement iteratively and they've upgraded it in small pieces over the course of decades and decades, and that's why it's so reliable. And so when you look at something like an ETA or a Sellita that's going to be based on the ETA movement, that's just going to be a proven, true, consistent, and a movement that's going to keep you keeping time decades into the future. Whereas if you take the risk on a manufacturer that is, maybe not one of these high-end independents that we could almost consider to be art and truly the highest forms of horology, if we're talking about a watch that is, for lack of a more graceful term, mass-produced, if we're talking about that kind of watch, I would every day of the week prefer that watch have something like an ETA or a Sellita or another proven and true movement where I know that it's going to work, right? It's almost like when Rolex used the Zenith El Primero movement, they actually changed it a little bit, tuned it down a little bit on the beat rate, but when Rolex wanted a chronograph movement, they didn't immediately come out with their own automatic chronograph movement. They used the proven and true El Primero movement. So even the greats, those that have perfected creating these products iteratively for a more consistent product, even they know that is a reliable way to do it. And the Swiss know this because there are manufacturers out there that are producing these movements off the shelf for so many brands. And there's also the manufacturers of the watches that produce the watches for the brands using these movements. One of these is called Walca, another one is Xantia, and they produce these actual watches using these off-the-shelf movements, and they know this because it's reliable, it's been proven over decades, and the watches just work. And at the end of the day, would you rather have this kind of vanity term of, oh, I have an in-house movement, but my watch is in the service center for 6 to 8 weeks, or maybe even longer with things going on in the world of international trade? Or would you rather have the watch on your wrist, keeping time, and it has an ETA, but it's been modified for these reasons, but I really love the design and I'm attracted to the watch for so many other reasons, more so than someone invented a new movement and decided to take a gamble on it? What do you think about in-house movements? I think at this point, it's pretty clear how I feel about them. They're okay, they can be okay, but I'm also very happy with stock or long proven third-party movements such as the ETA because they do work. And oftentimes when you have something like a sports watch, you want the watch to work, right? What do you guys think? Leave it in the comments below. Please do not forget to give a thumbs up, like, and subscribe. I really do appreciate it. And you can find me on Instagram, The Real John P. Thanks, guys. You've been chatting with John P. Ciao.